Nothing will crush a real estate investor's spirit like landlord stress. The difference between being successful and miserable in managing properties is education. Welcome to Landlord University, where landlords learn. Landlord University is recorded from inside the RentPrep office, where Stephen White and Jeff Pearson share the lessons learned from working with some of the most successful landlords.
Welcome to Landlord University Night School. I'm Jeff Pearson. I'm here with my co-host, Stephen White. Hello, Stephen. How are you doing this evening?
Yeah, pretty good, Jeff. So the idea for this topic we're going to be covering today on leasing to two adults or multiple adults in a unit came from an In the News episode that we just did with our content manager, Jennifer. And she brought an article to us that talked about growing trends, and it's becoming more and more popular for for these multiple adult households where they people need to split the rent, share the responsibility. They can't afford it themselves. There's a million situations that you can think of where you would need to rent to two adults who may not be married or have the type of relationship where it's going to have an impact on the information you're pulling from them.
Right. And ultimately, when you think about it from a background standpoint, they're either married or they're not.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to the legal situation, because if you do a background check on a couple, it could be a same-sex couple that is, they have all of the benefits of a married couple without being married, because in this day and age, there have been a lot of advancements in that. But when it comes down to doing a background check, you're either married or you're not. And when it comes to applications and things like that, you have to look at it as either married or not married, no matter what the relationship between the people are.
Yeah. And the important thing, even if you are dealing with a married couple, you got to run the background checks independently because you don't know how long they've been married. They could have been married last year. And, a lot of times this has certainly happened to us here at RentPrep. We'll run a background check on both people, and sometimes we'll dig stuff out that the person they just married aren't even aware that was out there. That's happened on more than one occasion. So even even their spouse may not be aware of some of the skeletons in their closet. So you want to be aware of sites that offer joint background checks. A lot of times they're searching for joint filings, which in a perfect world, yeah, you'd be able to look at one person and uncover a bankruptcy that was filed jointly by both of them, or a judgment, or things like that. But a lot of times, especially if you're dealing with a professional tenant, somebody that's been around the block and knows how to get away with certain things, they're smart about this stuff. They're going to put stuff only in one person's name and drag that person's name through the mud, and have the other person kind of be on the understanding that they're the one that are going to have their name on leases and things like that for a new lease, because they don't want that eviction to pop up that they know about, or a judgment or something like that. So you really need to treat applicants individually for screening purposes, whether they're married or not. Again, you don't know how long they've been married. You don't know what the background, the situation is, or what each of them are bringing to the table. And a lot of times they don't even know what's in each other's backgrounds. So
Yes.
it's definitely important to just treat them each as their own individual applicant.
And when we think about the background check, obviously there's the credit portion, the employment history, there's the criminal background check, and the evictions. And if you think of a couple of women who are friends who are going to rent a place together, they're pooling their money together, and one of them has a stellar record on everything. The other one, no evictions, no criminal history, good employment, but has some credit problems and has, just starting to come out of it, let's say. That's the type of situation where, for me, we talk often about you want to establish what your criteria are. You want to be sure that you don't hem and haw. There's no gray area. But for me, and I'll be curious to get your thought on this, when you've got a situation like that, where essentially you've got a co-signer who's living there with that person and they don't have any of the other red flags. It would be different if that person had evictions, or if that person had criminal issues or didn't have a stable job. But in that situation, I don't see as much of a problem if everything else works out. If those people are the best candidates for tenancy, I would I would definitely consider renting to them. What's your thought?
Yeah, and I know a lot of landlords that set up these matrix that would weigh that type of thing, and I think that is something that you need to weigh. If everything else looks good and one applicant has some credit issues, however, like you mentioned, the other applicant's good. Um, let's say that the one applicant, you need to look at their employment too, what their income is, and there's a lot of factors that go into it. So I think that credit can be overlooked, or certain things can be overlooked when you do have multiple people that are being considered, because the other person is going to help balance that bad credit situation out if their credit's outstanding. Obviously, if you're dealing with both of them and they both have poor credit, that's going to come back as a pretty high risk, because you know that one person's not going to be able to be the more solid sort of foundation for the other person. They're both kind of in tough times, and
Yes.
they're both financially distressed. So I agree, and you also want to consider, like we've talked about a lot of times, is that worst case scenario. What happens if things go bad and now that person with the good credit leaves and moves out and leaves the other person high and dry? Or so you got to consider that too, and
Hmm.
that's something to take into consideration. Can this person um, survive on their own for a little while? That's going to be something that they can handle. uh, and obviously, anytime that you're renting to roommates or multiple adults like this, you want to make sure that they each understand their financial responsibilities in those situations. What happens when one moves out, or what happens if one person breaks the lease, the other one doesn't, because these things definitely come up a lot. And especially if it's a relationship situation, it's probably more likely to come up that, if something goes wrong with the relationship. 50% of marriages end in divorce. I don't know what the statistics are for just boyfriend girlfriends. I got to imagine it's higher.
Right.
So chances are it's going to happen, and you have to go over that situation with them, as uncomfortable as it may be for them too, to think like that. But everybody needs to be prepared for a worst case scenario.
Yes. And I would even go over with a married couple.
Yeah. Oh,
They need to
definitely.
understand that the same rules apply, and your rental agreements and lease agreements need to be written to cover that, and you need to make it clear to them when they're signing that they're both responsible, each individually responsible for paying the rent.
And the other thing to add to it is, what do you consider an adult? And obviously, it's 18 and over, but um, a lot of landlords will try and run a background check on a 17-year-old. A 17-year-old, you know, son or daughter who's living there, and they see them as an adult. They're an older child, and so they want to run the background check on them. 18's the limit. Can't be younger than 18. They don't exist in a database until they're 18, basically. So they'll have nothing if you're running them before 18. If they do have any kind of criminal records, you're not going to see them anyway. They're going to be sealed, because most likely they were, they're juvenile criminal records.
Right.
So it's not worth running anybody that's under 18. However, any good landlord's going to have in their lease that 18 and over has a background check ran on them. So it's important to establish that pattern when they do turn 18, that you do the background check, and every year thereafter, if you're running screenings on them year after year, to at least just check for criminal records, things like that, that you're including that 18-year-old occupant as well. Even though they're not on a lease, they may not be have any financial responsibility to it. But if you have a troublemaker who's 18 and causing problems with neighbors, it's certainly reason to terminate a lease and say, listen, this your 18-year-old son is causing all kinds of problems, and they've got a criminal history. I can't have that here.
And the other piece to that is, once they become an adult, then if you evict the parents, the kid could actually stay there. You would have to, again, once they're 18, it's a different beast from when they're
Yeah.
17. But I wouldn't be surprised if a kid decided they wanted to be stubborn. Parents move out, the kid stays there. You have to go through the eviction process to evict that kid also.
They're a legal occupant. Yeah.
Yeah.
We've talked about that before. No different than a squatter. And so many landlords will get frustrated, and I can completely relate to the frustration, because anytime that you're dealing with something that defies logic, like the fact that you would have to evict a squatter, who's not paying anything. But that's the letter of the law, and that's how it is. So you have to consider that in these situations too. That, like you said, once they become an adult, they're a legal occupant, and they have to be treated like that.
Yeah. And that's one of those laws that goes back into history that really came around because of so many bad landlords who did so many bad things and kicking people out for a multitude of reasons. And unfortunately, as landlords today, we're paying the price for that. And all we can do is try to do all of the things available to us to protect ourselves from being put in that situation. And unfortunately, there are some things that are just beyond our control. You're sometimes just going to be faced with squatters or situations where you have to evict people, and you have to find out that there are 3 different people in the house than are on your lease, and you have to evict each one of them individually.
Yeah, and the other thing to consider when you're dealing with especially younger adults, and the point that you had brought up about one not having strong credit or maybe both not having strong credit, anytime that you're dealing with that situation, don't take the idea of a cosigner off the table, especially if they're younger adults. My experience in the credit industry and from a collection perspective, one of the easiest ways to collect past due rents. Now, we all know that past due rents is a really, really hard thing to collect.
Yes.
Recovery rate is the lowest in the industry. It's lower than dentists. It's lower than your lawn care bill. It's pretty low. Your chances of getting that recovered. However, if you have a responsible parent who signed a financial responsibility agreement, they co-signed for somebody, even if they're 23, 24, whatever the age is, when that money's due and you go back to the parent, you're way more likely to get that money paid because the parent's going to bail the kid out versus trying to chase after that young adult who it's going to be a long time before they have an extra $2,000 in their pocket to pay you what they owe.
That's a good point. And I believe we've talked about that in some previous episodes of Night School.
Yeah, there's for a cosigner and a financial signer, somebody who's assuming that financial responsibility, it's not limited to, it has to be a teenager, or it has to be, somebody who's under 20 or whatever the case is. It could be a young adult. It could be somebody in their early 20s or something like that. The situation is going to dictate that, obviously, but don't be afraid to ask if everything else looks good and they seem like a good qualified applicant. If you need to find creative ways to make it work, then the cosigner is usually a good idea.
It's a really good point. Well, great, Stephen. I think that wraps up another episode of Night School, and I look forward to talking with you tomorrow evening.
Great. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for listening to Landlord University. And remember to visit rentprep.com/landlordu to see show notes and access free resources like forms and guides. And be sure to check out Jeff Pearson hosting his own hit podcast at thementorimpact.com.